My topic is Justice Robert H. Jackson in the Katyn forest. And of course, he, the American chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, in fact, never set foot in Katyn forest. It is instead a historical survey of a high official's responsibility, the prosecution effort at Nuremberg, and the historical accomplishment and failure of Nuremberg with regard to the truth on this topic. I'm going to approach this in three parts. So, part one, the crime. April 1943 is for the West, through the media, through Goebbels, and the German announcement of the discovery in the Katyn forest, the moment of knowledge, the moment of zero becoming some increment of awareness. And Robert Jackson at that time is a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. He's been on the court 3 years. He's a young lawyer of enormous public stature. So his front pages, Washington Post, Washington Times Herald, New York Times, Herald Tribune, etc., in those days, included the side-by-side stories that were the unfolding of the Katyn revelations, and then the Russian denials, and alongside that, other events of April 1943. I don't think it's been mentioned, but if you pull up those front pages, you will see that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto occurs simultaneously with this revelation. But what one finds in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barrett, handed down in June of 1943, but drafted in March and April and May of 1943, is two passages that I think reflect very tangibly the front page and the adjacent news items, atrocity, terror, war information that is part of his screen. One is the word ghetto, which he reaches out to use in the Barrett opinion. And it's not something one finds in any previous piece of his writing or that I've been able to find in any subsequent piece of his writing. It is a 1943 use of a word that is, of course, the Warsaw word. The other thing one finds is in his description of why we can afford to let Jehovah's Witness school children who have a religious scruple against saluting a graven object, even our own flag, choose that as a matter of conscience over a compelled patriotism, is because the American First Amendment order stands against compelled orthodoxy, compelled unanimity. The alternative, Jackson writes, and here I suspect I know what news item informs his pen as he's drafting. The alternative is the unanimity of the graveyard. Now, the most famous cemetery in the world, the graveyard of the spring of 1943, is Katyn. Part 2, Nuremberg. The Nuremberg assignment that comes to Justice Jackson comes from President Truman, who has succeeded Franklin Roosevelt, who had, of course, committed that the high Nazi perpetrators would be prosecuted as criminals after the war. What those allies led by Jackson do is meet and do diplomatic work in London in the summer of 1945. They have to work out a shared system of law, an architecture for creating a new international tribunal, all kinds of procedures about how it will operate. None of that had been laid as groundwork in advance. And so during the summer of 1945, across a square table at Westminster Abbey, Jackson, Russian counterparts, British counterparts, French counterparts work out what that fall comes to be Nuremberg. Into the fall of 1945, after they've selected the site, after they're assembling the evidence, as they're drafting the indictment, the Russians insert a sentence. Their proposal is to charge the Germans, as in, for American lawyers, a bill of particulars with, among many other things, the murders of over 900 Polish officers at Katyn. The drafting process is principally American and British in nature, but General Jan Nikitchenko is the Russian participant, and he keeps trying to insert this sentence. And the Brits, who really have the principal pen, keep redlining it and taking it out. Back and forth, and eventually, as a matter of Allied insistence, the Russians say, this is one of the things. The charge is returned in October, and the trial begins in November. Jackson delivers the opening statement that is properly remembered as perhaps the most brilliant English language courtroom speech in history. And this sentence, this accusation, is not mentioned. Until February, very near the close of prosecutorial evidence, when a Russian assistant prosecutor, Comrade Pokrovsky, summarizes the finding of the Soviet white paper, the 1944, etc., blaming it on the Germans, Soviet report. He's presenting this pursuant to a provision of the London Agreement, which says the tribunal may take judicial notice of Allied government reports. And so he says we have a Russian report that said the Germans did Katyn. That's the end of the prosecution as it stands at that moment. The defense cases are about to begin. And here, in an ironic way, and I assure you my tongue is in my cheek, the hero of the truth about Katyn asserts himself. His name's Hermann Goering. And he tells his lawyer, Otto Stammer, the Wehrmacht did not do this. And you must defend the good name, I'm quoting Hermann Goering, of the Wehrmacht by challenging this charge. I authorize you to do it. I will assist you in doing it. And so Goering, defending himself, and he not particularly connected to any part of the Soviet white paper on the Germans did Katyn, authorizes his lawyer to make that part of the Goering defense. And Stammer begins to push. He first argues to the tribunal that I want witnesses. It takes months, but he's eventually granted witnesses. There's an attempt to negotiate that down to affidavits by the Soviets, and Stammer won't give up his ground. And at the very end of the trial, what the court authorizes is each side presenting 3 witnesses. We'll hear 3 from you on the defense side, and then we'll hear 3 from the Soviets on the prosecutorial side. And those are the last 6 witnesses who testify in the Nuremberg trial. And you'll hear more about it, but at that point, the word Katyn is never heard again. Not one of those 6 witnesses mentions any defendant. It's a flop. Stammer, if you will, succeeds in defending the good name of the Wehrmacht. Part 3, the trial on trial. And in 1951, Polish-American constituency representatives from representing members of the U.S. House of Representatives passed the resolution that creates the Maddening Committee. Another witness who testifies is Otto Stammer, Goering's lawyer. And he's asked, was Nuremberg an effort across the alliance, the Americans and the Brits in bed with the Russians, to pin it on the German? And Stammer says, God, of course not. The Americans, the British, Nuremberg was totally fair to me. They gave me discovery, they gave me resources, in fact they paid him and they gave him housing, and they let me defend the Wehrmacht against this libelous charge that the Germans had done Katyn. All of that somewhat already diffuses the Nuremberg issue before the time Jackson testifies. But on November 11, think by the way historically about that day, on November 11, 1952, Jackson testifies before the Madden Committee. Jackson comes to the committee and delivers powerful, direct, and I think fully satisfactory testimony. He's diffusing 2 misimpressions or charges that the House is bringing, really, against Nuremberg. One is this idea of conspiracy, that it was a cabal to pin it on the Germans. The other is a notion of underperformance. There's a bit of a legislative idea among the Madden Committee members that Nuremberg's job was to figure out who did it and to prosecute them. In fact, one of the members says, well, there were 4 nations, so if 3 of you had voted to turn around and indict the Russian guy sitting next to you, why didn't you do that? Well, the London Agreement is very clear. It's a 1-year project for Axis perpetrators of crimes. In other words, German criminals. The jurisdiction of Nuremberg did not allow the justice that the facts by this time were showing. And the Madden Committee demonstrates its, I think, ultimate satisfaction by, in its final report, quoting Jackson's final paragraph of his testimony. Jackson closed by saying, "This history will show, if it is now deemed possible to establish responsibility for the Katyn murders, nothing that was decided by the Nuremberg Tribunal or contended for by the American prosecution will stand in your way." They suspected, and over time, I think it's fair to say they more or less knew, they being the British, they being the Americans, the French as a trailer, that the effort to pin it on the Wehrmacht was wrong. And Nuremberg did justice by not allowing that Russian effort to succeed.